The night my sister-in-law threw a laboratory envelope onto the middle of the dinner table at my in-laws' house, in front of the children, in front of the aunts and uncles, in front of every family member gathered for a Friday dinner I never should have agreed to attend, and announced in a voice designed to be heard by everyone that the envelope proved I had been cheating on my husband. The first thing I felt was not shame or panic, but something far colder and far more final, which was their absolute certainty that this was the last time this family would ever do something like this to us. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people who discover too late that actions have consequences, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Valerie. I am 36 years old. I have been married to Edward for 9 years, and during those 9 years I learned that my husband's family operated under a logic that took me far too long to name clearly, a logic where love was conditional, where generosity was a tool of control, where every family dinner had an invisible agenda that only some people knew about in advance, and where I, from the very first day, had been considered an outsider they tolerated because Edward loved me but who would never be accepted as a real part of the family because I came from the wrong side, did not have the right last name, had not grown up in the right neighborhood, and had committed the unforgivable mistake of making their son happy in ways they could not claim credit for producing, and that, for a family like Edward's, was something that is never completely forgiven. Edward is the oldest son of Gordon and Beverly, a couple who on the surface projected the image of a united and hard-working family. He with his hardware store that had occupied the same location for 30 years, she with her way of receiving guests that made everyone feel welcome for exactly as long as it served her purposes. And beneath that surface existed a financial structure I discovered gradually, and came to understand over time, as the central control mechanism Gordon and Beverly exercised over their adult children, because Edward, who earned a decent salary as a logistics supervisor at a distribution company, transferred to them every month an amount that had begun as a little help here and had over the years become an implicit obligation that no one had formally agreed to but that everyone treated as permanent. And when I attempted, in the 4th year of our marriage, to have an adult conversation with Edward about whether that amount had any limit or any condition, their conversation ended with him telling me I didn't understand what his family had sacrificed for him. And with 3 days of silence I learned to interpret as the price of asking reasonable questions at the wrong moment. The sister-in-law who threw the envelope that night was named Sandra. She was 3 years younger than Edward, lived 8 minutes from her parents' house, and had a relationship with her mother that I can only describe as a strategic alliance where the two provided each other with information, validation, and momentum for any initiative aimed at keeping Edward within the family's radius of influence and keeping me in a position of permanent insecurity, because an insecure woman is a woman who does not ask difficult questions, who does not set limits, who does not suggest alternatives, and who eventually stops being an obstacle between a son and his family of origin. And that had been Sandra and Beverly's project from the first time Edward brought me to that house on a Sunday in March 10 years ago, and Beverly looked me up and down with a smile that had exactly the temperature of a room without heating. The comments had begun before the wedding and had never stopped. They were comments that had the shape of innocent observations but that functioned as small instruments of erosion designed to make me feel inadequate in a constant and cumulative way. Comments about my cooking, about how I dressed our daughter Clara when she was a baby, about my professional decisions, about the fact that I worked full-time when the women in this family have always prioritized the home, about the apartment Edward and I had bought together, which Beverly invariably described as a small in a tone that converted that word into a verdict about my capacity to provide an adequate home for her son, and I had responded to each of those comments with the same strategy one had adopted from the beginning, which was not to respond, to smile, to change the subject, and to save my energy for when it truly mattered. A strategy that in retrospect was useful because it taught me not to waste ammunition, but that also carried a real cost because everything I did not respond to was interpreted by Sandra and Beverly as confirmation that they could go further. Our daughter Clara was 7 years old that Friday night, 7 years old and possessed of the kind of observant intelligence that children develop when they grow up, paying close attention to adults because the adults around them never behave in a completely predictable way. And Clara had spent the last 4 years building a relationship with her paternal grandparents that I had deliberately protected despite everything. Because one thing is what adults do to each other, and a very different thing is depriving a child of her grandparents over conflicts she does not understand and that are not hers. And that distinction, that decision to protect Clara's relationship with Edward's family despite what that family was doing to me, was perhaps the decision I was most proud of during all of that period, and it was also the decision Sandra chose to attack that night. Because what she did with that envelope was not only an attack on me, but an attack on the child sitting 2 chairs away who was old enough to understand that something very wrong was happening even if she did not have the words to name it. What Sandra did not know, what none of them at that table knew, because Edward and I had made the deliberate and conscious decision not to share it with anyone in his family, was the clinical truth that the envelope was attempting to contradict. A truth we knew with documented medical precision, and that converted Sandra's accusation not only into a lie but into the kind of lie that can only be constructed by someone who took a fragment of information, interpreted it from their worst possible assumption, and decided to use it as a weapon at the moment they calculated would be most effective, in front of the largest available audience, without caring that in that audience sat a 7-year-old girl who was the daughter of the 2 people they were attempting to destroy. What was in that envelope, what Sandra placed on the table with the gesture of someone who believes they are about to change the course of a story, was a copy of a laboratory result she had obtained through means I did not yet understand at that moment, but would reconstruct with sufficient precision in the following days to understand the level of planning that lay behind it. And the result showed a genetic profile with a technical note that Sandra had interpreted, or had decided to present as, if she had interpreted, as evidence that Clara's biological father was not Edward, and she announced it with a voice she had prepared before we arrived, a voice that pretended to be broken by concern and that was in reality built on the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting months for this moment. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which at a table of 12 people with a 7-year-old girl seated among her cousins is a silence that feels like an hour, and during those 4 seconds I looked at Edward and Edward looked at me. And what passed between us in that exchange was not panic or confusion but something far closer to the confirmation of a decision we had both already made without yet having spoken it aloud, which was that this ended tonight, that this ended here, and that how it ended mattered because Clara was watching. What Sandra did not know, what none of them at that table knew, was that Edward and I were carriers of a recessive genetic condition we had discovered during the prenatal testing of Clara's pregnancy. A condition that did not affect the health of either of us but that in the specific combination of our genetic profiles produced in Clara certain physical characteristics that an untrained eye, or an eye that was actively searching for a different explanation, could interpret as inconsistent with Edward's paternity, and we had made the decision not to share this information with Edward's family specifically because we knew his family, because we understood that any sensitive medical information in Beverly and Sandra's hands would eventually become exactly what it had become that night, a weapon, and we had discussed that risk with our genetic specialist, Dr. Ferreira, who had explained the complete profile to us with patience and told us to keep the documentation because at some point it might be necessary. And those words, at some point it might be necessary, had turned out to be one of the most accurate predictions anyone had made to us in 9 years of marriage. I stood up from the table, not because I needed to leave but because I needed to move, and went to where Clara was sitting, her eyes very wide and wearing the expression I recognized as the one she puts on when she's processing something that frightens her but that she does not want to show, and I crouched to her level and told her very quietly that everything was fine, that adults sometimes said confusing things, and that I was right here, and Clara looked at me for a second and then nodded. With that serious gravity children have when they decide to believe their parents even though something in the atmosphere tells them the situation is not entirely what they are being told. And that specific moment, was the moment something inside me finished resolving itself. Because watching my 7-year-old daughter use all of her child's energy to process the damage the adults in her own family were causing her was something for which I had no more patience, no more understanding, no more margin. Edward spoke then, and what he said was brief and was delivered with a calm I knew cost him something because I know my husband and I know when he is using the voice he uses when he is controlling something he would prefer not to have to control. And what he said was that he was asking everyone to wait, that there was information the family did not have and that this was the moment to share it. And Gordon, who had been silent since Sandra threw the envelope with the uncomfortable expression of someone who knew what was coming but had not found a way to stop it, said yes, that they should speak, and Beverly said that everyone deserved to know the truth, delivering that phrase with the specific intonation she used when she believed the truth was going to prove her right. Edward took out his phone and called Dr. Ferreira, our genetic specialist, who that evening, thanks to a text message Edward had sent him 40 minutes before we arrived at the dinner because something in the way Sandra had been writing to him that week had made him suspect something was being prepared, was available and waiting for the call, and Edward put the phone on speaker in the center of the table, and Dr. Ferreira explained for 12 minutes, with the precision and patience of someone accustomed to conveying complex information to people without scientific training, the genetic condition Edward and I both carried as Carries, the specific characteristics that combination produced in Clara, the reason certain laboratory results interpreted without clinical context could lead to incorrect conclusions, and the fact that he had in his possession the complete documentation of the case since their pregnancy, including the paternity tests Edward and I had conducted privately precisely to have that documentation available if it ever became necessary. When Dr. Ferreira finished speaking and Edward ended the call, the dining room of my in-laws' house had the specific silence of a place where something that cannot be undone has just occurred, and Sandra was looking at the table, and Beverly was looking at Gordon, and Gordon was looking at his hands, and the aunts and uncles and cousins who had been the audience Sandra had chosen for her announcement were looking in various directions like people who would prefer to be anywhere else, and Clara, my 7-year-old Clara, looked at me from her chair and asked in a very small voice whether we could go home now, and I told her yes, that we were leaving, and that was the last sentence I spoke in that house that night. We left my in-laws' house that night without saying goodbye to anyone. It was not a dramatic gesture and it was not planned. We simply collected Clara, took our things, and left, and on the drive home none of the three of us spoke for the first 15 minutes. Clara fell asleep in the back seat before we reached the halfway point with that capacity children have for finding sleep even when the adult world around them has been displaying its worst version of itself, and Edward drove in silence, with one hand on the wheel and the other over mine, and when we arrived home and put Clara to bed and closed the door to her room, we sat in the kitchen and Edward told me he was sorry, not in the way one says sorry when they do not know what else to say, but in the specific way of someone who has just seen something with total clarity for the first time and understands that what they are seeing did not begin that night. The following days were days of conversations Edward and I should have had years earlier and had postponed for reasons that the time seemed sufficient, and that in retrospect we recognize as the reasons people always have for not doing the difficult things. Conversations about money, about limits, about what each of us had tolerated in silence believing it was the way to keep the peace, and that in reality had been the way to maintain a situation that did not deserve to be maintained, and at the end of those conversations we had made 3 decisions that we communicated to Edward's family in writing, not in person, not by phone, in writing, because written documents do not permit convenient reinterpretations and because we wanted what we said to be recorded in exactly the words we chose. The first decision was that the monthly transfers to Gordon and Beverly would stop immediately and permanently, that if at any future point Edward decided to help his parents financially he would do so voluntarily, transparently, and with my agreement, but that the implicit obligation that had existed for years without anyone having formally agreed to it ceased to exist from that day, and this decision, which I expected would produce the most intense reaction, actually produced the longest silence, which told me that Gordon and Beverly knew perfectly well that money had no legitimate basis, and that on some level they had always been waiting for someone to say it to them out loud. The second decision was that Sandra would have no contact with Clara for a period we would define based on her future behavior, not as punishment but as a direct consequence of having chosen to use a 7-year-old girl as an audience for an accusation she knew or should have known was false, and that if Sandra wanted any future relationship with her niece, that relationship would have to be built from a completely different place than the one she had occupied until that moment, and this decision was the one that produced the first written response from Beverly. A long message that arrived 2 days later beginning by saying we were overreacting, and that Sandra had only shared information that concerned her, which I read completely, saved in a folder, and did not answer. The third decision was the one they least expected and the one that most affected them in practical terms, which was that we would stop attending family gatherings at their house indefinitely, not because we did not want a relationship with them, but because a relationship that only exists on terms they define unilaterally is not a relationship but a dynamic of submission, and that if they wanted to maintain a connection with Edward and with Clara, that connection would have to be built under conditions that both adults in our family considered safe for our daughter, and that condition was not being met, and until it was, distance was the only reasonable response. What happened in the weeks that followed was something I had not fully anticipated, which was that the absence of Edward, of his presence, his money, and his permanent willingness to resolve and to forgive, produced in my in-laws' family a reorganization that revealed how much of what that family called unity actually depended on what Edward contributed. Because Gordon had to make decisions about the hardware store that he had for years delegated to Edward's availability to intervene when something went wrong, and Beverly had to manage the household on the actual budget they had without the monthly supplement that had arrived so reliably for so long that they had stopped counting it as something external and had started counting it as their own. And Sandra, who had spent the first 15 days sending messages that ranged from accusation to superficial apology and back to accusation, eventually went quiet. A silence I interpreted not as genuine remorse, but as the silence of someone who was recalibrating, but that in any case was preferable to what had existed before. Gordon called Edward 6 weeks after that night, and it was the first time in Edward's memory that his father had called him without a practical reason attached, and in that call Gordon did not apologize exactly, because men of his generation and character rarely find that word in a direct way, but he said that he understood things had gone too far, that Sandra had acted wrongly, and that he hoped that with time things might get back to normal. And Edward told him yes, that he hoped so too. But that getting back to normal did not mean returning to what had been before but building something different, and Gordon said he understood, and he may have understood or he may have only been saying what he needed to say in that moment, but Edward ended that call wearing an expression I had not seen on him in years, which was the expression of someone who has just had an honest conversation with his father for the first time in his adult life. Clara asked about her grandparents 3 weeks after that night, with the direct naturalness that 7-year-olds have for asking the questions adults have been avoiding for weeks, and we told her that the grandparents and we had had a disagreement, that adults sometimes have disagreements, and that right now we were all taking some time to think about how to treat each other better. And Clara processed that for a moment and then asked if she had done something wrong, and we told her no. Absolutely not, that what had happened had nothing to do with her and had never had anything to do with her, and Clara nodded with that 7-year-old gravity and said okay, and went back to her book, and I waited until she left the room to allow myself to feel everything I had been holding since that night, because there are things a mother holds so her daughter does not have to carry them, and that is the kind of work that is not visible but that has a real weight and that deserves to be acknowledged even if only by oneself. What I learned from all of this is that limits that are not built with clarity do not disappear. They become the space where other people build their own rules at your expense, and that waiting for the right moment to protect what matters makes sense until the moment that what matters is a 7-year-old girl sitting at a table with very wide eyes processing the damage the adults around her are causing, and that moment, that specific moment, is the only moment that actually matters, and that when that moment arrives the best thing you can do is be prepared, have the documents, have the witnesses, have the truth on your side, and stand up from the table with the calm of someone who knows exactly what they are going to do next.